Okay. Before we begin this morning, Ernie, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Amen. Our loving and gracious Heavenly Father, we come forward this morning, grateful that there has given us another day of life, a day that's set aside to honor thy Son and you as we worship together here today, Father. We pray that all that we say and do will be in accordance with thy will and acceptable in thy sight. Be with each teacher this morning as they teach their classes. Be with Bob as he is teaching us up here. Bless him that he might remember those things that he's prepared to say. Father, we pray for our sick, the ones that are struggling. We pray for Jessica that she might soon be up and about, and Levi also. We pray for Delford that he'll overcome his problem with vertigo and other issues. And there are many in our congregation, Father, that you know who they are, and I can't mention them right now, but bless them and help them, Father, as they struggle through life. Father, bless us in thy care. Forgive us of our sins. Go with us as we attend this class this morning.
Okay, this morning we're going to be talking about Joshua the man, not the book of Joshua so much as Joshua the man. What he did, the things he did, what made him a special person. And in my opinion, he's one of the really, really key people in the Bible. And I'll tell you, I have a bias. Personally, he's my favorite character in the Bible. And the reason is he's better than George Washington, but he has a lot of things. George Washington in our country fought the war that got us our independence. And we're going to see today that Joshua was a military guy from the beginning of Exodus when they left the country. But he's a very humble man. He's a great leader. He was someone that God chose and that God completely supported. And I think we'll see a lot of things about Joshua today, or be reminded, probably we already know most of them or all of them, but we'll be reminded of how we should live our lives, and what some of the consequences are if we do what's right by God, and what can be consequences when we don't. So let's start with the very basics. Joshua was a slave. That's where he started from. He was in the land of Egypt. He departed with all the other people of Israel when they crossed the Red Sea. So he was an eyewitness to the miracle that God performed to lead the people out of Egypt. And, big picture, he's going to be chosen by God to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. And we sort of know the background of that. Moses wasn't going to be allowed to go into the promised land. The original plan that God had was Moses was going to lead the people out of Egypt and into the promised land. But a couple of things happened along the way that stopped that from taking place. One, Moses made a mistake, and God chose not to allow him, as a form of punishment, not to allow him to go into the promised land. And two, the people who were being led by Moses didn't have enough faith to follow what God wanted done, and because of that, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So when we start to look at Joshua, most of us, or at least I did before I was really doing the study, tended to always think about Joshua as someone that starts in the book of Joshua, and he starts with God selecting him to lead the people into the promised land. But the truth is, this is not Joshua's first rodeo. Joshua is someone that's mentioned numerous times in the Bible. And I want us to look, starting with some of the things about Joshua that are facts. First, he was chosen by God to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. That's in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Joshua was also a figure even before God had selected him to lead the people. He was a figure in the events of Exodus. Let's look at Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 15, and I'll read that.
What was that?
Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 15. This is starting in verse 8. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon on one side and on the other side, and the hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will totally put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Well, the reason I wanted to read that, God told Moses, you go tell Joshua to remember what I'm telling you, giving you, and wanting you to write down in a book. So God had already seen something in Joshua that he had high regard for. And also, Joshua was the leader, the military leader for that first battle with the Amorites. So, that's our first, that's one of the first exposures we have to Joshua. Let's also take a look at the fact that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the law, Joshua accompanied him. Joshua went with Moses up to Mount Sinai, where Moses is going to receive the Ten Commandments. So Moses has already established a relationship with Joshua, and Joshua is becoming a key figure in the leadership of Israel. When they were coming back down from the mountain, Joshua is the one that heard the sound in the camp. And Joshua, in Exodus 32, and verses 17 and 19, witnessed the people having built the golden calf and were worshiping it. So we see Joshua again with Moses at that event. We know, all of us I think know, Joshua was one of the 12 spies that were sent out by Moses to explore the land of Canaan. And that's in Numbers chapter 13, verses 16 through 17. One other little aside, Joshua was of the tribe of Ephraim. That's in Numbers 13, chapter 8. So this is really sort of a key thing that Joshua showed his faith in God, his obedience to God. when they came back, 10 of the spies of the 12 basically said it's hopeless. We can't take the promised land. The people are too powerful. But 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, said they could. They had the faith that could be done. And of course we know, because of the people basically wanting to follow the 10 spies that didn't believe things could be done and didn't have the faith in God they should have, they were doomed to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until every man died that was of that generation. So the only 2 people from that entire nation that could enter the promised land of that generation was Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua, we know a lot about. Caleb, we see some about. But Joshua goes on to become a really key person once they are going to enter the promised land after they've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. One of the things that I got out of this, he doesn't back up. Man can fail, and often does, but God will always find a way to save the situation. And he does. He's going to punish Moses, who was really the man that had been prepared by God to take the nation of Israel into the promised land. But his sin prevented him from doing that. So there had to be another man who could lead the nation and help God accomplish his long-term plan, which was to have that nation that he chose to bring Christ, the Savior, into the world and save the world. So Moses' failure didn't stop God. And the 2 men, while they have a lot of similarities, have some differences. Moses was born as a slave, but we know he was put in the boat so he would be saved from the slaughter that was going to go on with all the male babies born in Israel. Moses grew up in a setting where he was rich, he was well educated, he had all the comforts of life. Joshua was a slave. We don't know anything about the type of work he did. That's not told to us. We only know he was a slave that came out of the land. We know that Moses tended to be rash and when we read his accounts as a leader, he struck the rock. He was angry that they didn't do that the people were complaining. So and some of the other things we've seen, Moses would get very angry. When we look at Joshua, we don't really see him as an angry man or a vengeful man or a man that wants to give up and quit. We're going to talk about today, he's a man. He makes mistakes. He made a couple of mistakes that are identified in the Bible. One is an opinion I have. The other is just a fact, and we'll get into that. But what I want to do right now is recognize that while they have a dissimilar background, they have different personalities, they even really have different skill sets. Moses, because of his education and his background in the royal court in Egypt, he can deal with writing. We know he wrote several books in the Bible. We know that he's not a military leader. He did not lead the people of Israel in all of those battles. He was doing what God wanted him to do. But Joshua is more of a military guy, but he's a very humble guy. And the reason I mentioned George Washington earlier in our country, There was a time when George Washington could have been anything he wanted to be, including, in effect, a king. But he was such a humble man, he really only wanted to follow the law, the Constitution of the country, and never tried to gain long-term personal power. Well, I think we're going to see in Joshua, he has some of those same attributes. He did not seek high office or Moses' job. In fact, he's the most loyal person that Moses had, in my opinion, working for him. And we'll see that in a few moments. But there are a lot of things similar about Moses and Joshua, and I want to touch on those because God chose both of these men. They both played a key role in getting the nation of Israel established in the Promised Land. One brought them all the way to the border. The other one led them in and led all the military conquest and divided the land in the way that God wanted done. So let's look at some of the similarities to Moses' history and also Joshua. First of all, Joshua sent out spies to scout Jericho, 2 of them, just like Moses sent spies to go into the Promised Land and see what was there. We can see that in Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. And I'll read that. But the children of Israel committed a trespass and whoops. I've got the wrong. It's Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. I just wrote down the wrong thing. And Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, "Go view the land, even Jericho." And they went and came to a harlot's house named Rehab and lodged there. And we sort of know the story of Rehab. The 2 spies were afraid that they were going to be killed and discovered. Rehab allowed them into her house, but she asked something. She had already heard and knew about what had happened to the people that Israel had encountered already. And so she bargained with the 2 spies. "I'll protect you, but," and it's a big but you have to let me and my family live. And they made that agreement. So I say that's important because in that case, they were really violating, in effect, God's law. And this is my opinion. They were told they were to utterly destroy all and drive out all the inhabitants in the land of Canaan. But these 2 guys actually made a bargain that really violated what they were supposed to, what the nation was going to be supposed to do. Joshua allowed that deal to stand. And God didn't punish him that I can see for having allowed that to happen. But it was a violation of what they were supposed to do, to get all the people out of the land. But the thing with the 2 spies is important because it's the same. There was trouble that came about when Moses sent out the 12 spies. They're coming back and telling the people that they couldn't take the land, led to ultimately them having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. These 2 people, there's not that consequence. They made a deal to save their life, and God seemed to have accepted it. Here's another thing that's similar, and I think it was done probably as much to help Joshua as reinforce the people's faith. Joshua crossed the Jordan River on dry land, just like Moses led the people across the Red Sea on dry land. And Stephen, why don't you read for us Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 17.
So it was when people set out from the camp to cross over Jordan, that the priests carried the ark of the covenant before the people. And as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, where the Jordan overflowed all its banks during the whole time of the harvest. But the waters which came down from upstream stood still and rose in a heap.
So the same,
Far away at Adam, the sea which lies beside the Zarephath. So the waters that went down into the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. And the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the Jordan, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground. So all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan.
so the same type miracle that was done with Moses leading the people was also done when Joshua was given the leadership of the people. In fact, it's very similar because Joshua is just assuming his role to lead the people. Just like Moses, his first big job after the plagues was to lead the people out of Egypt, and they crossed on dry land. And you have to believe that that had to be something that you would think would have really given the people of Israel the faith they needed to do everything God wanted done. But the people are just kind of like us today. We've got a lot of problems and issues, and they couldn't, that didn't work for very long. It wasn't too long after they were traveling to the promised land. We read, and I'm not going into all that, but we read they had one issue after another of being unhappy and not having the faith they should have had in God after they had just seen what most of us would say is probably the greatest miracle that had occurred up until that time. And the same miracles performed for Joshua, and I think that it does two things. First, I think it has to strengthen Joshua's faith and belief that everything God's told him, that he can rely on it. And second, as leader of the people, it also has to give them faith in God and faith in Joshua. And I think it does both.
You know, they had a physical view of God, you know, where it parted the Jordan, the Red Sea. But you know, today we don't have that, but we do have the Word, which is just as powerful or more powerful than actually seeing, you know, like with Nazareth.
Right.
Lazarus, not Nazareth. You know, he, you know, the rich man was told even if one come back from the dead, which would be a great miracle.
Right.
You know, but he says if they don't believe the word of Moses, the word, you know, they won't believe. So you know, the word for us today is just as powerful or more powerful, really, than seeing the parting of the.
That's right. That's a good point. We have the entire history and can see that there's not any conflict in it, written by all these different men, and yet we have a lot of people don't have faith in God or really believe the Bible is real. But anyway, that's another major similarity between Moses and Joshua, and both are carried out by God, and I think it was for the reasons that we talked about. Here's another parallel between Moses and Joshua. The Israelites celebrated the Passover just before they left the land of Egypt to go on the journey to the Promised Land. I don't think it's coincidence. What did they do as soon as they crossed the Jordan River? They celebrated the Passover. That's in Joshua chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. And that, I think, is symbolic, the fact that this is a new beginning for the people of Israel. They've come out of the land of Egypt with God's miracle. And they celebrated the Passover, which was a miracle in itself, because all the Egyptians we know were firstborn were destroyed. None of the people of Israel were. And now when they're getting ready to go into the land of Canaan, they are going to face a people that in total are more powerful than they are. But they celebrate the Passover. And what is the very next thing that happens after that? The manna that they've been being supplied stopped. So God had fed them all these years. But as soon as they had celebrated the Passover and were in the land of Canaan, he stopped the manna. And we can read that. I'll do it. It's in Joshua chapter 5, and I'm going to start in verse 10. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even the plains of Jericho. And they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day. And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So God had fed them on that journey. God is going to feed them for the next year. They don't have crops. They're on the move. But God is going to let them have food from the people that's produced it in the land of Canaan. So for the next year, he's going to feed them. It's not manna, but it's going to be food from the promised land. Now here's where I'm going to call on Garrett to help us a little bit. Also in chapter 5, and in verses 13 through 15, we're going to see a stranger appear. So it's Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, and I'll read that. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. So, I don't know, we know that Moses encountered, some say an angel, some say it was Jesus, but in the burning bush, Moses fell down. And also, either the angel or Jesus told him, take your shoes off. You're on holy ground. The same thing occurs here with Joshua. Now, I don't know. It's one of three things. Either one, it's an angel, but usually you don't fall down and worship an angel. And if you do, the angel would accept it. But Joshua worships this person, and he's told he's on holy ground, just like Moses was told the same thing at the burning bush. So Gary, who is the stranger? That's the question.
It's Jesus.
Huh?
It's Jesus.
Okay.
He also refers to himself as a captain or commander of the army of the Lord. And that,
Right.
especially in Isaiah, that's how he's referred to a lot, the captain of the Lord's host, or
Okay.
commander.
Okay, well, thank you, because that's important, because what this stranger tells Joshua, we'll see comes about. God is going to fight with Israel. He's not going to leave them on their own to confront all of the armies and the kings in the promised land. And we're going to see that God does intervene and fight for the people.
You know, thinking about Christ being the commander, you know, if you think back, you know, when he was before Pilate, his trials, you know, and I believe on another occasion, he said, I could call down 12 legions of angels,
Right.
you know, which showed him as
It has the power.
the
Yeah.
power of the command.
Right. Also, Joshua, another similarity, they're gonna meet to fight the people of Ai, and we won't go into the sin of Achan and all that, but after they had been defeated the first time by Ai, Joshua was commanded by God to extend his spear to defeat the people of Ai. You remember when when they were going to have the battle with the Amorites, what was Moses told to do? He was told to hold the rod of God up. And as long as he did what God had told him to do, they were winning the battle. And so God was basically fighting on the side of Israel, in effect, when Moses was holding that rod up. When he did what he was supposed to do, everything went their way. Well, we're seeing here that Joshua is being told to extend his spear. And he does that. And just like Moses at the battle with the Amorites, Joshua keeps his spear held up until the battle is over and they have killed all of the people of Ai. And we can see that in Joshua 8, chapter 8, verse 8. 18, chapter 8, verse 18. And the Lord said unto Joshua, stretch out the spear that is in thy hand toward Ai, for I will give it unto thine hand. And Joshua stretched out the spear that he had in his hand toward the city. Of course, they had the battle, and he continued to keep the spear out until they had killed all of them. And we see that in verse 26 of that same chapter, where it says, for Joshua drew not his hand back, wherewith he stretched out the spear until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. So there's two things from this. One, God's intervening on their side, and Joshua is obedient to God. He does exactly what God told him to do. He didn't take the spear down until every last one of them were killed. So we see two things. One, God becomes evident to the people that he is the one that is giving them the victory. And Joshua understands that, but the people have to understand it too, because Joshua had to hold the spear up just like Moses had to hold up that rod. And the outcome was the same in both battles. When you do what God says to do, he's unstoppable. What caused him to have trouble with Ai the first time, Ernie?
Instead of Achan, he taken some gold, silver stuff from Jericho.
That was Jericho, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, when he did that sin, God chose not to help him the next time.
Yeah. Just said 300 men up Ai, said, ain't nothing up there.
Right.
They whooped them bad.
Right. Now here's a another parallel. Joshua dies at the age of 110. And you can see that in Joshua chapter 24, verse 29. He had completed his work. He had led the people in the promised land, and they had conquered, not all of the land, as Garrett said, but they had conquered enough of the land that everybody had a home to go to. Moses died at 120 years old, and he had actually completed all that he could do that God wanted done because he couldn't go in the promised land. But he didn't die until he has the people brought all the way into the promised land. So you have two men that were both leading the country until they were really in a pretty ripe old age. 110 for Joshua and 120 for Moses. But here's the thing that is so amazing to me was at their physical condition and these in their old age. It's really amazing. In the case of Joshua, he didn't even start his job until he was 85 years old. That's when he assumed. Let me find I'm looking quickly at my notes for the verse that tells us how old Joshua was. I know that age 85 was whenever they were going into the promised land. I'll come across that later, but basically Joshua was 85 years old when he's in the promised land leading the people, and he basically told the people, I'm 85 years old, but my strength is just like it's always been. God had blessed him with unnatural health to where he was just as strong at 85 as he had been as a young man in his 30s. And Moses, when he died, the one thing that we are told is that his eyes weren't dim, even though he was 120 years old. You know, his eyes, but we're told his eyes were not dim. He still enjoyed good health as the leader of Israel, right up until the time God chose him to die, when he had to go up to the mountain. And then he was blessed to get to see the promised land before he did die. So that's another parallel. Both men served until really, really old lives based on our view of things. To God, anything's possible. Even a woman having a baby like Sarah did at an advanced age. This is really my opinion, They both had God intervening in their lives to give them the help they needed to do the things that they needed to do. And here's another similarity. Both of them, both Moses and Joshua, give a farewell speech, in effect, just before they die. They both seem to know when they're going to die. And, both give a farewell speech. If you want to look at that, the farewell speech of Joshua is in chapter 24 of Joshua, and Moses is in Deuteronomy chapter 33. So, as we're looking now at the two people, boy, time gets away from you in a real hurry. Now I'm going to speed up a little bit. Joshua and Moses were both obedient. But both had an issue. What did Joshua do that I think is my opinion on my part, but the fact it was wrong? When they encountered the people of Gibeon, if I'm pronouncing that right, they tricked them, and they tricked the other leaders of Israel into thinking they were not people from the land of Canaan, because they knew what Israel would do to people from the land of Canaan. But the mistake Joshua made, he didn't consult God. He let the people swear an oath that these people could stay and be with them, in effect, in league with them. If Joshua had consulted God, that would have never happened. And we know what the order that God had given was, you have to drive all the inhabitants out of the land of Israel. Well, Joshua made that decision without consulting with God. And that may or may not be what caused, ultimately, a lot of trouble, because they never got all the people, as Garrett taught last week, they never got all the people out, all the people of Canaan out of the promised land. They got most of them out, but they didn't get them all out, and God had already told them, if you don't get them all out, they're going to be a thorn and a prick to you. They're going to be trouble for you, because they worshiped idols. And Joshua didn't get that done. Moses, we know, struck the rock instead of speaking to it as God had told him to. The age of Joshua is at Joshua chapter 14, 10, and I'm going to read that real quick. This is Joshua speaking. And now behold, the Lord hath kept me alive, as he said, these 40 years, even since the Lord spake the word unto Moses, while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now I am in this day 85 years old, and yet I am as strong this day as I was in the day that Moses sent me, as my strength was then. Even so is my strength now, for war, both to go out and come in. So even at 85, he hadn't lost any strength. So God had a special job for Joshua and blessed him. Joshua was loyal. Joshua, whenever there was a person who was, God gave 70 people the ability to prophesy, and 2 of the people started prophesying out in the camp, which showed the people they had been given this gift of God. Joshua went to Moses and said, don't let them prophesy. He didn't want any of Moses' special relationship with God to be diminished by these other 2 people. So he was trying to protect Moses as leader of Israel, and Moses told him, no, if God's given him this gift, it's not a problem for me, in effect. But Joshua was loyal to Moses. Joshua was loyal to the people that made the 2 mistakes. The spies that cut the deal with Rahab, he honored the deal, which really said he was loyal to those men that he had sent out. He was loyal to the people that made that decision, those princes that wanted to have the Gibeonites become part of their group, even though they weren't people from Israel. So Joshua was loyal to Moses. He was loyal to the people around him. So he was a humble man. The main thing Joshua did is he was obedient to God. We can estimate that he served probably at least 30 years or so as the leader of Israel. And he started when he was close to age 85. We know he died at 110, so we know he was leader for at least 25 years. And Joshua's main job was to settle the people in the land of Canaan. He did that. And we know at the very end in chapter 24 that verse 28, it said, so Joshua let the people depart, every man unto his inheritance. So while he may not have gotten all of people of Canaan driven out, every Israeli, or every person in Israel had a home in the promised land and a place to go. So he accomplished the big thing that God wanted done, getting the people into the promised land and then dividing the land so that it was equitably done to give each person a home, because they didn't have a home in Egypt when they left. They were slaves. So that's all I've got this morning. Anybody have anything they want to say or issue?